Welcome to Silver Serenades, a quiet harbor for grown-up love. This is the journey to us. James and Helen board a springtime train with nothing but good manners and old grief for company. Miles pass, sandwiches are shared, and lantern-lit whispers soften into hope. At the coast, the tide asks a tender question. Are we brave enough to begin again? Chapter 1. Departures. James Carlisle lifted his suitcase onto the rack above his seat with a soft grunt, then settled into the upholstered cushion with a sigh of relief. His knees protested after the climb onto the train, but he ignored them. A man of 70, he had learned long ago that complaining did nothing but sour a perfectly good afternoon. He unfolded his newspaper, its pages crisp, smelling faintly of ink. Around him, the bustle of departure filled the car. Children tugging at mother's sleeves, a young couple murmuring into each other's ears, the conductor's deep voice calling for last tickets. Beyond the glass, the platform gleamed under a pale spring sun. James had boarded trains all his life, though never with quite the same hollow expectation. He was headed to the coast, to spend a week by the water before visiting his eldest daughter. He told her he wanted the fresh air, the sound of waves, a change of scenery. He did not tell her that the silence of his house had grown too loud, the echo of his late wife's absence too sharp. He expected nothing more from the journey than the familiar rhythm of wheels on tracks and the thin comfort of his paper. Across the aisle, Helen Morgan smoothed the folds of her skirt and adjusted the strap of her handbag. She held her ticket in one hand, not because she feared losing it, but because the act of holding it gave her something to do with fingers that trembled when left idle. At 68, Helen had retired after 4 decades of teaching literature to high school students. Her days were quieter now. Too quiet, she often admitted to herself. She read, she gardened, she visited friends, but the hours stretched long. The prospect of seeing her sister's family at the coast filled her with both excitement and hesitation. Would she fit into their busy lives? Or would she feel like an extra piece of furniture, moved out of obligation rather than desire? She tucked the ticket carefully into her handbag as the train lurched forward, pulling free of the station. The landscape began to slide past, brick buildings giving way to open fields, then to groves of trees pale with new leaves. It was only when she glanced sideways that she noticed the man across the aisle. He sat with a paper held high, silver hair catching the light, his expression intent. Something about his posture, upright, dignified, yet softened by weariness, made her pause. There was kindness in the set of his jaw, though she could not have explained why she thought so. James lowered the paper to fold a corner, and his eyes met hers. A nod, polite and reserved. Helen returned it with a small smile before looking quickly away, her cheeks warming. The hours stretched. At one stop, a boy selling sandwiches hurried down the aisle, his basket fragrant with bread and cheese. Helen hesitated, fumbling in her bag for coins. Her hand shook slightly, and the boy looked impatient. "Allow me," came a voice beside her. James had risen, steadying himself against the swaying car, and handed the boy a few bills. "One for the lady, one for myself." Helen blinked, surprised. "Oh, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," James replied simply, handing her a neatly wrapped sandwich. "Besides, it saves the boy from waiting while we search for change." She laughed, soft but genuine. "Then thank you. I'll repay you when the conductor passes again." "No need." He unwrapped his own sandwich, the scent of ham and mustard filling the air. "Consider it a courtesy of the rails. Strangers often share meals, don't they?" Helen tilted her head, studying him. "Do they?" "They should," James said, taking a bite. "It makes the miles shorter." She smiled again, more openly this time. "Perhaps you're right." They ate together, trading small remarks about the scenery, the rolling hills, the sheep grazing, the wildflowers already blooming despite the lingering chill of early spring. Helen found herself relaxing, her earlier nerves easing. There was something steadying about his presence, the way his voice carried both strength and gentleness. When the sandwiches were gone, James folded the paper neatly and set it aside. James Carlisle, he said, extending a hand across the narrow aisle. Helen Morgan, she clasped his hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. His grip was firm, but not overbearing, warm against her palm. Well, Helen Morgan, James said, settling back into his seat. It seems we'll be fellow travelers for a good many hours. Better to know each other's names than to sit in silence. Indeed, she agreed, her lips curving. Though silence has its place. That it does, he said with a nod. But sometimes a voice makes the silence richer, not thinner. The train swayed gently as it carried them onward, fields giving way to small villages, the air through the window cooler now. They spoke of simple things, books they had loved, favorite meals, the frustrations of aging joints. Helen confessed her fondness for poetry, James's devotion to gardening. The hours passed as though the miles were being counted not by rails, but by laughter and shared stories. Helen realized with quiet astonishment that she was enjoying herself. James, too, felt the unfamiliar warmth of companionship stirring where loneliness had long sat unchallenged. By the time twilight painted the horizon, they were no longer strangers but something more. Two souls who, by chance, had found themselves seated side by side on a long train ride that was beginning to feel like a journey towards something neither had expected. Helen glanced out at the fading light, then back at James. "You were right," she said softly. "About what?" "Sharing does make the miles shorter." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "And perhaps sweeter, too." The train rolled on, carrying them toward the coast, toward family visits and unknown tomorrows, but also, though they did not yet know it, toward each other. Chapter 2, Windows and Whispers. The train moved with a steady rhythm, rocking gently as twilight deepened outside. Lanterns lit the car in a golden glow, and passengers shifted into more relaxed postures. Some dozed, some whispered, some stared dreamily out the windows. Helen found herself neither restless nor weary. Instead, she felt curious. James had folded his newspaper and tucked it away, leaving his lap empty, his gaze on the passing landscape. It was darker now, the hills only faint silhouettes against a lavender sky. Helen hesitated, then spoke. "Do you often travel by train?" James glanced at her, thoughtful. "Not as much these days. My wife and I used to take short trips when the children were young. Up the coast, sometimes inland to the mountains. We liked the sense of moving without the burden of driving. But since she passed, I've gone less often." Helen's breath caught. She had not expected him to speak of such a thing so easily, but there it was, since she passed. The words carried weight, the kind that shaped a man's silence. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Thank you." He looked out the window again. It was nearly 10 years ago. Cancer. Quick in its cruelty, he paused, his hands folded loosely in his lap. "I learned how quiet a house can be after that." Helen nodded slowly. "I understand." His eyes returned to her, questioning. "My husband, George, died 6 years ago. Heart failure. Sudden. One morning, we were planning to paint the back fence, and by evening, I was sitting alone in a hospital corridor. I think the suddenness was a mercy in some ways, but also a theft." James's expression softened, a mirror of her own ache. "I am sorry, Helen." "It's life," she murmured, "but it does leave a kind of emptiness you don't know how to fill. Friends try, family tries, but there are hours, long hours, that only seem to echo." For a while they said nothing. The wheels clattered along the tracks, steady and sure. Around them, other passengers murmured or slept, but the space between Helen and James was filled with something quieter, deeper. At last, James cleared his throat. "What did you teach?" "Literature," she said, smiling faintly. "High school. I spent 40 years trying to convince teenagers that Shakespeare was worth their patience, and that poetry wasn't only for dreamers." "And did they believe you?" "Some," she replied, laughter dancing in her voice. "A handful in every class would light up, and that was enough. I still get letters now and then from students who became teachers or writers or simply lifelong readers. Those make all the hard days worthwhile." James leaned back, impressed. "You must have been good at it, if they're writing to you still." Or stubborn, she said with a shrug. Both, perhaps. Helen tilted her head. And you? What filled your years? Accounting, he said simply. I kept books balanced, papers tidy. Not glamorous, but it kept food on the table. And the garden was my solace in the evenings. My wife used to tease me that I spoke to the tomatoes more tenderly than to her. Helen chuckled. And did you? Sometimes, James admitted with a smile. But she forgave me because the tomatoes turned out sweet. They both laughed, the sound easy, unforced. As the laughter faded, Helen realized her hands had unclenched. She was no longer gripping her handbag, no longer measuring every word. She felt lighter. It startled her, the ease with which James's presence filled the gaps in her guard. The conductor passed through, checking tickets and nodding to each passenger. When he moved on, James leaned a little closer, lowering his voice. You know, I didn't expect to talk this much today. Helen smiled. Neither did I. And yet, he continued, I can't seem to stop. Perhaps the miles make it easier, she suggested. Something about being in motion, as if the past feels lighter when the world is moving forward around you. James nodded slowly. Yes, that sounds right. Outside, the stars began to pierce the sky, faint at first, then brighter as night deepened. Helen watched them through the glass, their reflections mingling with her own face. She thought of George, of evenings when they had sat on their porch watching the same constellations. Then she thought of the man beside her, his presence steady as the rhythm of the train. Do you believe, she asked quietly, that we get more than one chance at companionship, at love? James was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady on the stars. At last he said, I didn't. Not until today. Helen turned to him, her breath caught in surprise. His expression was calm, but his words carried the weight of sincerity. She felt warmth spread through her chest, unexpected and profound. She looked back at the stars, unsure of what to say, and let the silence speak for them both. The train rolled on through the night, carrying them toward the coast, carrying them toward family visits and responsibilities waiting at the end of the line. But in that moment, in the glow of lantern light and the soft hum of motion, James and Helen discovered that journeys could begin long before arrival. Chapter 3. Morning Light. The train rocked gently through the night, its wheels beating a steady rhythm against the rails. Helen dozed in her seat, her head tipped slightly toward the window. James, too restless for sleep, found himself watching the dark fields glide past under the starlight. Every so often, he glanced at her. In slumber, her face seemed softer, the lines at the corners of her eyes not so much age as evidence of laughter. By dawn, the car stirred with quiet activity. Passengers shifted, stretched, and murmured greetings. Helen stirred as the first rays of pale gold light spilled through the window. She blinked, smoothing her scarf, and caught James watching her. Good morning, she said, her voice husky from sleep. Good morning, he replied, offering a small smile. You didn't snore? She laughed, startled. Is that what you were watching for? Among other things, he said, and she shook her head, amused despite herself. The train slowed at a country station, and a vendor boarded with a tray of pastries. James bought two without asking, handing one to Helen. Now you're spoiling me, she said, accepting the warm parcel. Consider it a tradition, James replied. Every good journey deserves bread. They ate quietly, the sweet scent of cinnamon filling the air. Around them, the world brightened, fields dotted with farmhouses, orchards beginning to blossom, streams flashing silver in the morning sun. Helen pressed her hand lightly against the window, as if to touch the beauty rushing past. I forget how much there is to see when you're not driving, she murmured. That's what I always liked about trains, James said. The world opens up. You can actually notice it. Their conversation wandered easily. Helen told stories from her years in the classroom. How one boy had secretly slipped haikus into his essays, how another had read Dickens aloud with such gusto he nearly toppled from his desk. James spoke of his garden, the stubborn roses that refused to bloom until his wife once scolded them, after which they flowered as if appeasing her. Helen laughed so hard at that image she had to dab her eyes with a handkerchief. "Oh, I wish I could have met her," she said. "She would have liked you," James answered softly. His tone carried no shadow, only truth. Helen grew quiet, touched. She looked at him then, really looked. His face was weathered but strong, his eyes the clear blue of late summer sky. Something inside her shifted, a tremor she had not felt in years. They sat in companionable silence, watching the world roll by. After a while, Helen spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I sometimes wonder what my students remember of me, if anything at all. You spend years trying to light sparks, and then they scatter into the world. Did I make a difference?" James turned toward her. "You did. I can tell. You speak about them like they mattered. That alone makes the difference. Trust me, they'll remember." She smiled faintly, warmed by his certainty. "And your children? Do they remember your patience with the tomatoes?" He chuckled. "Oh, they tease me about it still. But yes, they remember. And I hope they'll remember that their father was steady. Not remarkable, not brilliant, just steady." "Steady," Helen repeated, nodding. "That's no small gift, James. The world depends on steady." The train curved along a river, sunlight sparking on the water. Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a slim volume of poetry, its cover worn with years of use. "May I?" she asked. "Please." She opened to a bookmarked page and began to read, her voice low but clear. The words spoke of journeys, of rivers that wound through valleys, of travelers who discovered themselves by walking the same path together. When she finished, James sat quietly for a moment, the words settling between them. Then he said, "That's exactly what this feels like." "What does?" "This train," he said simply. "This morning. You and me." Helen felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." The whistle blew as the train surged forward, carrying them closer to the coast. Neither spoke for some time, yet neither needed to. The rhythm of the wheels, the glow of the morning, and the fragile, steadying awareness of companionship spoke enough for both. Helen closed the book and rested it in her lap. She turned to James and offered a smile, gentle, knowing. "Perhaps," she said softly, "this is the beginning of something neither of us expected." And James, meeting her gaze, felt hope stir like the first bloom of spring. "Perhaps it is." Chapter 4. The Layover. The train slowed as the conductor's voice called down the aisle. "We'll be at Milford Station for an hour while the engine is serviced. Stretch your legs, folks. There's a café just across the square." Passengers stirred, gathering bags, adjusting coats. Helen tucked her poetry book away, her heart quickening at the thought of stepping off. She had not expected more than hours of seated conversation, yet here was a chance to walk beside James under real sunlight. James stood, offering his hand to steady her. "Shall we?" She slipped her fingers into his without hesitation. "We shall." They joined a stream of travelers filing out. The platform smelled of coal and damp stone, but beyond it lay a cobbled square lined with small shops and a café whose chalkboard promised fresh bread and strong coffee. The two of them fell into step as though they had done so for years. Inside the café, the air was warm, scented with butter and cinnamon. James ordered coffee for them both, and Helen chose a scone to share. They settled at a corner table near the window, watching as locals bustled about their morning routines. "It feels strange," Helen admitted, breaking the scone in two, "to sit here with you after only a day of knowing each other, as though it's the most natural thing in the world." James smiled, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Perhaps that's what happens when you've lived long enough. You recognize what's true more quickly. There's no need for pretense." She considered that, nodding. "Yes, the older I get, the less patience I have for small masks. Life is too short for them." They lingered over the scone, trading stories in the easy way of companions with time to spare. Helen spoke of her sister's house near the coast, filled with children and grandchildren, a place both comforting and overwhelming. James spoke of his daughter's cottage, where roses climbed the trellis and grandchildren left chalk drawings on the walkway. At one point, Helen laughed so hard at one of his tales, how a grandchild had buried his reading glasses in the garden to help them grow. that she dabbed her eyes with her napkin. "I don't remember the last time I laughed like this," she confessed. "Neither do I," James said softly. They grew quiet for a moment, the silence not awkward but reflective. Sunlight poured through the cafe window, catching the silver in their hair, softening the lines on their faces. Helen felt a warmth, not from the coffee, but from the presence of the man across from her. When the clock chimed the hour, they rose reluctantly and made their way back to the platform. The train loomed, steady and waiting, smoke curling into the sky. As they climbed aboard, Helen touched James's arm. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For turning an hour's layover into something I'll remember." James met her gaze, his expression gentle. "The thanks is mine, Helen. You made it more than an hour. You made it a gift." They returned to their seats, the train jolting forward once more. The countryside unfurled outside the windows, green fields dotted with wildflowers, streams flashing in the sunlight. Helen settled into her seat, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She realized that somewhere between the laughter and the stories, between the coffee and the scone, she had begun to feel not like a widow traveling alone, but like a woman discovering companionship again. James unfolded his newspaper, but didn't read it. Instead, he glanced at Helen and smiled quietly to himself, as though the miles ahead had suddenly become far shorter and infinitely sweeter. Chapter 5. Truth in Motion. By mid-afternoon, the train rolled through country fields bathed in slanting sunlight. The car was quieter now. Many passengers napped, lulled by the rocking rhythm. Helen sat with her hands folded in her lap, gazing at the shifting landscape. James noticed how her expression softened as her thoughts wandered. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Helen hesitated, then smiled. "That I'm glad I took this trip. I almost didn't. I thought of staying home, convincing myself it would be easier not to travel. But something told me to come. I suppose I wanted to prove to myself I could still begin something." James nodded, his eyes steady on her. "I understand that. I nearly canceled, too. My daughter encouraged me to go to the coast before visiting her, said the sea air would do me good. I told her I was fine, that I didn't need it. Truth was, I wasn't fine. I was afraid of being reminded of what I'd lost." Helen tilted her head, listening. "I keep my wife's chair in the same place," James continued, his voice low. "Her slippers are still by the bed. 10 years have passed, and I tell myself I've kept them there out of respect, but sometimes I wonder if it's fear. Fear of letting go." Helen's throat tightened. "I still have George's jacket hanging in the closet. Wool, with worn elbows. I run my hand over it sometimes like touching him again. My children have urged me to donate it, but I can't. Not yet." James gave a small, sad smile. "It seems we've both been living with ghosts." "Perhaps," Helen said softly, "but today doesn't feel haunted." He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but the first fragile threads of one. The conductor came by with a basket of fruit. James chose 2 apples, handing one to Helen. She bit into it, the crisp sweetness startling her with its simplicity. "Funny," she said, "how something so small can feel like a feast when shared." James chuckled. "My wife used to say the same about bread, that a meal is never the food alone, it's who eats it with you." Helen's smile softened. She was right. The train curved along a stretch of coastline, the first glimpse of the sea glittering under the sun. Passengers stirred, pointing out the windows, exclaiming. Helen leaned closer to see, her shoulder brushing James's. The brief contact sent a surprising warmth through her, and she didn't pull away. "The ocean," she whispered. "It's been years since I've seen it." James's voice was quiet but steady. "It feels like coming home, doesn't it? Even if you've never lived by it." She nodded. "Yes, like something ancient and forgiving." They sat in silence, watching the waves break against the distant shore. The moment felt timeless, as if the journey itself had become a space outside of years, where grief and loneliness had loosened their grip. Helen turned back to him. "James, do you believe we're allowed to love twice in a lifetime? Truly love?" He took a long breath, then answered with honesty. "I used to think love was one story. But maybe it's a library. Some shelves filled early, others waiting. Different books, but all part of the same life. Helen smiled through sudden tears. That's a teacher's answer. And it's beautiful. James reached for her hand, resting his over hers without pressing. She didn't move away. For the first time in years, she felt not only seen but understood by a man whose own heart carried scars, yet beat with a steadiness that matched her own. The wheels clattered on, carrying them closer to the coast, closer to family waiting at the end of the line. But in that moment, Helen and James felt they had already arrived at something far more important. Truth spoken, burdens shared, and the first fragile courage to open their hearts again. Chapter 6. Arrivals. The announcement came in the late afternoon, the conductor's voice steady over the hum of the car. Next stop, Brighton-on-Sea. 10 minutes to arrival. Helen folded her hands together, her heart quickening. She had been traveling toward this moment for hours, yet now that it was near, she felt an unexpected pang of reluctance. She glanced at James, who was tucking his newspaper into his bag with the same careful precision as always, though his expression was thoughtful. "Here we are," she said softly. "Here we are," he echoed. His eyes met hers, and she saw in them the same mixture of anticipation and hesitation. The train slowed, brakes squealing, and outside the window the sea gleamed, a wide expanse of blue, dotted with white caps. The station bustled with families waiting, porters carrying bags, children waving at the arriving train. Helen adjusted her scarf, smoothing it more than necessary. "My sister will be here," she murmured. "She insisted on meeting me." "And my daughter," James said. "She promised to send one of the grandchildren with a sign, as though I wouldn't recognize my own family." Helen laughed, but her voice wavered. "What happens now, James? Was this just a train friendship?" He studied her, his gaze steady. "That depends. Do you want it to be?" She swallowed. "No. Neither do I." The train shuddered to a halt. Passengers rose, pulling down bags, calling to one another. James stood, lifting Helen's suitcase from the rack before she could protest. "Let me," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. They stepped onto the platform together. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, the cries of gulls sharp above the crowd. Helen spotted her sister waving. Her niece and nephews clustered around. Across the platform, a little girl held a sign scrawled with the word Grandpa, and James's daughter stood, smiling behind her. For a moment, the noise and movement of the platform blurred around them. Helen turned to James, her heart full. "I'm glad he sat beside you." "And I'm glad I offered you that sandwich," he said with a grin. She laughed, then grew serious. "Will I see you again?" "You will," he said firmly, "if you let me call." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Please do." He squeezed her hand quickly, discreetly, before they moved toward their waiting families. Helen's sister enveloped her in a hug, chattering about the children and the house and the plans for the week. James's granddaughter tugged at his sleeve, showing him the sign she'd made. But through it all, Helen and James exchanged glances across the crowd, small, steady, full of promise. Later that evening, as Helen sat at her sister's cozy seaside cottage, she heard the waves crashing faintly through the open window. She thought of James in his daughter's home, perhaps settling into a guest room, perhaps listening to the same ocean from a different vantage. She smiled to herself, feeling the echo of his words. "Neither do I." This was not the end of their journey. It was only the beginning of deciding what to do with the connection that had bloomed between them. Chapter 7. By the Sea. 2 days after their arrival, Helen walked the narrow path that led from her sister's cottage to the shore. The morning air was brisk, the tide low, the sand damp and glistening beneath a silver sky. She had told her sister she needed a walk, though in truth she hoped, perhaps even expected, that James might be there. And he was. He stood near the water's edge, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the gulls wheel and dive. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile that warmed the chill air between them. "Helen," he said, as though her name itself were a gift. "James," she replied, her breath catching slightly. They fell in a step, their footprints side by side along the wet sand. The sea hissed and retreated, leaving little treasures, shells, pebbles, fragments of sea glass. Helen bent to pick up a smooth piece of green glass and held it up. "Do you think it was once part of a bottle?" she asked. "Perhaps," James said, taking it from her palm. "But now it's something different. Worn softer, more beautiful because of the years it's endured." She met his gaze, and she knew he wasn't speaking only of the glass. They walked in silence for a time, the waves filling the spaces between words. Finally, Helen spoke. "I worried after we stepped off the train that we might lose this, whatever it is we've begun, that the world would sweep it away once real life began again." James nodded. "I worried too, but standing here with you, I realize it's not something fragile. It feels steady, like the tide." Helen smiled, her heart easing. "Yes, like the tide." They stopped near a cluster of rocks where the surf broke more fiercely. James turned to her, his expression earnest. "Helen, I don't want this to be only a memory of a train ride. I want to see you again, often, to share not just miles but days, meals, walks, perhaps even gardens and grandchildren's stories." Her breath trembled, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of being asked so openly. "I want that too," she admitted, "but I'm afraid. Afraid of being foolish, of getting hurt, of—" He reached for her hand, clasping it gently but firmly. "We're both afraid, but I'd rather risk the hurt than return to silence." Helen felt tears prick her eyes, the wind tugging at her hair. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "Then let's risk it, together." For a long moment they stood there, the waves crashing, the gulls crying, the world vast and open around them. James lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, old-fashioned and tender. Helen smiled through her tears. "It seems the journey isn't over after all." "No," James said softly. "It's only just begun." They walked on, hand in hand, their footprints weaving into one trail that the sea would eventually erase. But the memory of that morning, the decision made, the courage claimed, would not wash away. It would remain, steady and sure, like the tide itself. Chapter 8. The Courage to Begin. The week at the coast passed in a gentle blur of salt air and family chatter. Helen helped her sister in the kitchen, read stories to her great niece by the fire, and walked the narrow lanes lined with weathered cottages. Yet every day, without fail, she found a way to see James. Sometimes it was a stroll along the promenade, where they paused to watch children fly kites. Sometimes it was coffee in the café near the pier, where the owner soon learned to bring them extra biscuits without being asked. Once, they sat on a bench overlooking the harbor and watched the fishing boats return, their hulls heavy with the day's catch. Each meeting deepened the quiet certainty between them. There was no rush, no pretense, only the simple joy of companionship, of laughter easily shared, of silence comfortably held. On the final evening before they were both due to leave, he to his daughter's cottage inland, she back to her own home. They walked along the beach as the sun dipped low. The sky was streaked with gold and rose, the sea glimmering like molten glass. Helen carried her shoes in her hand, her toes sinking into the cool sand. James walked beside her, his coat collar turned up against the breeze. After a while, he stopped, turning to face her fully. "Helen," he said, his voice steady but his eyes searching, "we've both lived long lives. We've known love, and we've known loss. I don't pretend this is simple, but I know this much. These days with you have been some of the truest I can remember. I don't want them to end." Her heart beat faster, though not with the giddy rush of youth. This was different, deeper, steadier, more profound. "Nor do I," she admitted. "But it frightens me, James, to begin again, to open myself." He reached for her hand, holding it firmly, grounding her. "It frightens me too. But perhaps courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to step forward anyway." She studied him, the lines of his face etched by years, his silver hair catching the fading light. Here was a man who had known sorrow, who had endured silence, who now stood before her with his heart open. And here she was, No longer a teacher guiding others, but a woman ready to claim her own lesson, that it was never too late to choose love. Helen's smile trembled, then steadied. Then let's step forward. Together. Relief and joy mingled in James's expression. He lifted her hand and kissed it, then drew her into his arms. The embrace was not rushed or tentative. It was certain, warm, and true. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, and felt her own fall into rhythm with it. The waves lapped gently at the shore, as if applauding. Above them, the first stars appeared, witnesses to a new beginning. When they parted, James kept her hand in his. This isn't just a journey to the coast, Helen. It's the journey to us. She laughed softly, her eyes shining. And I think it's the best journey I've ever taken. They walked back along the beach, hand in hand, their footprints stretching behind them in the sand. Tomorrow would bring goodbyes and logistics, phone calls and plans. But tonight there was only the steady tide, the twilight sky, and the courage of two hearts choosing, after years of silence, to begin again. And as the sea whispered against the shore, Helen knew this was not the end of the line. It was at last the beginning of a love that had been waiting for them all along. Thank you for traveling with Silver Serenades. If the journey to us brought you calm and a touch of courage, tap like so other seasoned hearts can find us. New tender romances each week.